lurks in the hearts of men. The shadow knows.
All right, well, now we are going to talk about a different kind of entertainment, a different kind of hero that was being geared in the early to mid 1930s, primarily toward teenage boys, pre-adolescent boys, young adults. I say boys, but lots of girls listen to and watch these things as well, and even a lot of middle-aged and older people. So we're talking about Pulp Fiction, as well as radio programs, and the two were very often interconnected. So first, let me tell you what we mean by Pulp Fiction. These are the magazines, the pulp magazines, as they were called, that had been introduced around the turn of the century and were becoming very popular in the 1930s. They were called pulp magazines because of the paper that was used. It was really, really cheap paper. It was barely better than newsprint paper, which meant that it was able to be mass-produced and distributed for a low price, which means that kids could afford it. Usually these magazines, well, not usually, always, although they had pulp paper pages and kind of line drawing illustrations on the inside, the covers were slick and were often beautifully painted that really could catch the eye. So these were kind of the successors to what had been known back in the late 1800s as dime novels. They had supplanted dime novels because, again, the process enabled them to be produced so cheaply that they could afford to have the nice covers, right? Now, radio dramas had become a thing by the 1920s, and a lot of the heroes that were produced for the radio dramas would cross over into the pulp magazines and have stories written about them. That's why I have them listed here together. So The Shadow is a good example of that. The Shadow started in 1930 as a radio program, and I started this slide with the famous opening. It was made into a movie, by the way, back in the 1990s with Alec Baldwin. So the Shadow, he's this mysterious figure with magical powers who wears a mask and goes around haunting the underworld, by which I mean gangsters. Also, another popular hero from the pulp magazines of the 30s, Doc Savage, Man of Bronze. And there was a pulp magazine called Weird Tales that frequently featured stories such as the one pictured here, The People of the Black Circle, by a writer from Cross Plains, Texas, named Robert Irvin Howard. And his most famous creation that frequently graced the covers of Weird Tales magazine was Conan the Barbarian. He also created Solomon Kane and King Cole and others. The popularity of The Shadow on radio in particular in 1933 led a station manager of a Detroit radio station to order his head writer, Francis Stryker, to come up with a character that's kind of a cross between The Shadow, who's really popular, and all the cowboy stuff that was becoming popular. And he came up with The Lone Ranger, 1933. That same radio station in 1936 introduced The Green Hornet, which was, both of these were made into movies about 10, 12 years ago. The Green Hornet, by the way, his secret identity is Britt Reed. The Lone Ranger's secret identity is John Reed. Both these characters were created by the same guy working for the same radio station. And in the story, the Green Hornet, who is in contemporary modern times, meaning the 1930s, is the nephew of actually the great nephew of the Lone Ranger. I also have the Phantom listed here. He was not from the pulp magazines, nor was he originally from the radio. The Phantom was a comic strip. Comic strips had started to become a thing in the 1890s. And by the 1930s, the most popular of the comic strips were not necessarily the funny animal ones, but were the adventure comic strips, stuff like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and so forth. The Phantom was an adventure comic strip, and the reason I have him listed here is that he was the first comic strip character to wear a mask. Now, all these guys don't wear masks, although you'll notice that most of them do. Masked heroes was not a new thing at all. In fact, in the early 1900s, say I think the decade between 1908 and 1918, had seen the introduction of some other masked heroes who would be popular, like Zorro, who I think, I don't remember the exact year, but it was in the 19-teens. The Scarlet Pimpernel, who was a masked swordsman in France. But there were only a couple of examples. All of a sudden, early 1930s, masked heroes are showing up all over the place. In the late 1930s, radio and pulp heroes gave way to another new thing, the superhero of the comic books. Now, comic books had only been a thing since about 1935 or so. They were bound collections. Initially, for the first couple of years, almost exclusively, they were reprints from newspaper comic strips. It wasn't until about 1937 or so that publishers started to release comic books with all new original stories. And one of the first to do so was called Detective Comics. Came out first in 1937, and it was just what it sounds like. It was stories about detectives. In 1938, two young men from Cleveland, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who were in their late teens, they had created a character called Superman that they'd been trying to sell to the newspaper comic strips, and nobody was buying. So they wound up selling this to the company that owned Detective Comics, National Publications, and Superman made his first appearance in 1938 in Action Comics #1 and was an immediate hit. These things were flying off the shelves, no pun intended. So National decided that they wanted another super type hero, and Bob Kane and Bill Finger the next year created the Batman, whose first appearance was in Detective Comics #27, which eventually became so synonymous with the company that they changed their name to DC for Detective Comics. Also in 1939, the first imitator of National Periodical / DC Comics superheroes came about. That was Marvel Comics #1, featuring the original Human Torch, the Submariner, King of the Seas, who actually predated Aquaman by a couple of years, Kazar, the Jungle Man, and there was a masked cowboy called, I think, the Masked Rider. So within a year after that, by 1940, there were dozens and dozens of superheroes, and quite a few superheroines started to appear in the early 1940s as well. So this was kind of the springboard for the comic book superheroes who, by the 21st century, as you know, would be dominating the entertainment industry. I would argue that the masked heroes of the pulp fiction magazines and the radio kind of naturally led to the comic book superhero. And I would further argue that the incredible popularity of all of those types of heroes, particularly the comic book superhero, could only have been as impactful and as widespread as it was if it had happened when it did in the 1930s. Why is that? Well, essentially, whether you're talking about the Pulp Fiction characters or the radio characters or the comic book superheroes, what you're talking about essentially is a power fantasy, right? And this was in media that were primarily geared toward pre-adolescence and adolescence, right? So middle age, or not middle age, but middle school kids. Although I guess in my case it proves you can also be a middle-aged kid and still be tied into this. But you remember what it was like in middle school. It sucked, didn't it? You know, I mean, there were all these issues that you had to all of a sudden deal with: social changes, physical changes, social changes, including the fact that kids start to kind of sort themselves into cliques and groups, sometimes by class around this time. So if you remember what that felt like, imagine if you were going through that. At the same time, there was a Great Depression, and maybe one or both of your parents were unemployed. And that at the same time that all that was happening, everybody in the newspapers and on the radio were talking about this crazy guy, Hitler. So just imagine how unsettling that would be and how incredibly powerless you would feel. And then think about how much of a draw it would be to immerse yourself into stories about these guys that you could pretend you were, these individuals who had incredible special powers and or skills that no one else had and were virtually unstoppable because they kept coming back, program after program, issue after issue. And if you could pretend to be that person or someone like that person, it could give you a little bit of a sense of power. And that would be, well, powerful incentive to continue following the exploits of those heroes. Now I'm going to tell you a personal story to sort of demonstrate how that can work. When I was little, I had several favorite uncles, but one in particular who was a really big influence on me. He really introduced me to my love of history. For example, he was very well educated, and I just really thought the world of him. In fact, I remember when I was probably 8 years old, 8 or 9 years old. He saw me reading Conan the Barbarian novels and comic books, and he sat down with me and explained what barbarians actually are, and he explained the historical context, and the fall of Rome and all that stuff, and it was just fascinating to me. Well, one day, near the end of fourth grade, when I was 9, almost 10 years old, I came home, and my family lived right next door to my aunt and uncle. So I came home, and I knew that my uncle had been sick. So I came home, and a friend of the family, very close friend of the family, took me around behind the house and explained to me that my uncle had died of a heart attack. And I was, my world came crashing down. It was a horrible, horrible feeling. And I ran into the house and I ran to my room. And immediately I got my plastic sword out and lined up all my stuffed animals and all my pillows and everything. And suddenly I was not this little fourth grader whose uncle had died. I was Conan the Barbarian, swinging his mighty broadsword into a swath of enemies that he was conquering. And my mom came to my doorway and saw what I was doing. She got a little bit upset because she didn't feel like this was appropriate behavior under the circumstances. And I remember the family friend explained to her, "You have to leave him alone. This is his way of dealing with it. This is his way of grieving." And of course, the grieving gave way to something a lot more, conventional. After that, tears and sadness that lasted for a very long time. But in the moment, in that initial moment when my world fell away, I just felt this overwhelming need to have power and to be able to pretend to be this fictional character who was virtually indestructible and who could wade into anything and come out triumphant was something that I had a deep psychological, emotional need for in that moment. And I think that, like I said, that helps to explain this moment in time in the 1930s, why so many kids in particular were so taken by Superman and Batman and the Lone Ranger and those other characters. I think that it would be an interesting thing to try to figure out why those characters have had such a big comeback in the last 10 or 15 years, although that's probably a discussion for another time. I could actually talk about this for an entire semester or for a full-length book. I've been known to do both. However, at this point, I think we need to move back to the main narrative of what's going on in the country during the Great Depression.